Hello, Simone. Today we are going to do an episode that focuses on fertility stats. And it's going to be a stat-heavy episode. It's going to be a study-heavy episode. And it's going to be on demographic collapse, which our audience loves.
The trifecta.
The trifecta. So in today's episode, we are going to focus on the nuances of when fertility decline does not follow the model, the more wealth an individual has, the fewer kids they have.
Mm-hmm.
Where are the kinks in this particular incredibly robust statistical trends armor?
Would you like to know more?
I like that we're looking at this because I think the exceptions to the general trend probably yield really useful insights.
So we're going to be focused on a few articles here, but one of the ones that I'm going to draw a lot from is actually from Lyman Stone, who runs the Institute of Family Studies, and it's called More Money, More Babies. What's the relationship between income and fertility? Now, something we should note here, and it's one of the reasons I'm looking at this, is I believe in always really digging deep when somebody says something that sounds, utterly preposterous or is obviously ideologically motivated, because there's often elements of truth in what they're saying that I may not be seeing on the other side of the ideological fence.
Right.
So those who are not familiar, haven't read a lot of Lyman Stone stuff, he really likes to manipulate statistics to try to argue his perspective. And his perspective is always that we should be doing more cash handouts and that this can be solved with Christianity. Those are generally the two arguments that he's always going to use. And so he'll often twist things to sort of this, Christian socialist perspective. But this means that he has to argue, and he has argued explicitly, that there isn't that much of a correlation between fertility and income, which is just a preposterous thing on its face. There was a piece that he wrote that was attacking us, and this is one of the claims he made when we were pointing out that you don't seem to be able to solve this with cash handouts. However, he has invested a lot of energy and a lot of his own personal credibility in debating this. And as such, he has found a number of interesting points that I may not have caught myself, which don't reverse either of the two larger truisms. The first being that you do not appear to, with any reasonable amount of money, be able to pay people or with social services increase fertility rates. And the second being that, generally speaking, the more income a country has or the more income an individual has, the lower their fertility rate is going to be. But there are modifications in this trend.
Okay.
Over where we see those in turn. So the first is that if you look in pre-industrial societies, the more income an individual has, particularly a man, the higher their fertility rate is.
In pre-industrial societies.
Yes.
And this is only with male fertility, not female fertility.
No, it's also female fertility, but it is more tied with male fertility. So this is from an article titled Men's Status and Reproductive Success in 33 Non-Industrial Societies, Effects of Subsistence, Marriage System, and Reproductive Strategy. And this showed a meta-analysis of 288 results of 33 non-industrial populations. And it showed that status is significantly associated with men's reproductive success, consistent with the evolved basis for status pursuit. Status hierarchies have changed dramatically, though, in recent eras. If anybody doesn't immediately see the implication of this, it does show that dysgenic fertility selection, sorry, I should explain what dysgenic means. Dysgenic means certain environments can cause things to be selected for in a population that do not actually make the population more fit, but just increase the number of surviving offspring that population has. A great example of this is rabbits in the UK. If you've ever seen rabbits in the UK, they're all deformed and weird looking and witless.
Wait, what? Really?
Yes, I don't remember the full story, but the point being is that they don't have natural predators. And because they don't have natural predators, it's literally just the ones that can have the most kids that survive. And so there is no real fitness preservation technique or pressure for the population. And so they end up being cancerous, witless balls of tumors. They're really quite gross if you ever see a rabbit in the UK. It's kind of scary. But where this is relevant to humans is we've been under similar pressures for a while. As we mentioned in our Can Society Become an Idiocracy episode, which, by the way, was ad restricted. I don't even think we went that spicy in that one. Just
Yeah, I saw that today. Maybe
humans
someone
have
flagged it.
genes. And I'm like, come on, man. Yes, humans have genes and they're correlated with intelligence and they're being selected against. This is like really clear in the data, but okay. I guess we'll pretend we live in your little fantasy world where everyone's born exactly the same. But anyway, the point being here that dysgenic selection started in humans with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, it appears, or with modern industrial society. And that before this, the more status someone was able to accrue, whether that was through, wealth or charisma or attractiveness or etc., the more kids they were going to have. Now, generally, the two things most correlated with a high fertility rate are low IQ and obesity, which are, witless rabbits, right?
I think it's low educational attainment, not necessarily low IQ.
Okay, low educational attainment, yeah.
But yeah, not ideal. Not ideal.
Obviously, this doesn't really help his larger point. What fertility rates were like in pre-industrial societies isn't exactly relevant in the modern world, but it is, an interesting and novel point nonetheless. But to him saying something like, well, you can't just assume that less income means more kids because in pre-industrial societies that wasn't true. It's like, yeah, but that's not relevant to the current
to a post-industrial society
problem that we're facing. That's like throwing sand in my eyes with statistics. This is what I mean when I say he likes doing the pocket sand thing a lot with statistics, and hope you don't notice.
Pocket sand.
Okay, so for the next point, he says here, the author argues that historic fertility declines were overwhelmingly caused by novel cultural norms, which are often correlated but distinct from income. So here I was looking at the study that he was looking at. It's called Culture and the Historic Fertility Transition. This paper presents a novel argument for the historic fertility transition, emphasizing the role of cultural forces alongside economic factors. The authors highlight a significant and abrupt decline in fertility rates among British households in 1877, which was observed not only in Britain, but also among culturally British populations living in Canada, the United States, and South Africa. The authors propose that the famous Bragadal-Bestant trial of 1877 served as a possible catalyst for this widespread change in fertility behavior. Now, this would be very interesting if it was true, okay? If it was true that only British people, like people in Britain and British immigrants, experienced a sudden and sharp fertility decline all at around the same year, starting at around the same year, due to some massive cultural change, I would be like, oh, that's really interesting. I mean, yes, we do know that culture affects fertility, but this would be a more acute effect than we had seen historically.
Yeah.
So do you happen to know what the Bragadon-Besant trial of 1877 was about?
No, I've never heard of it.
It was a book called The Fruits of Philosophy that discussed contraceptives. And the court trial was about trying to ban it. After the trial, book sales rose from around 1,000 copies to 125,000 copies.
So this was a Streisand effect thing?
It was a Streisand effect thing, but it also completely undermines the claim here. This was not a book that popularized contraceptives. It was a book that taught a population that didn't know how to use contraceptives broadly to how to use contraceptives broadly for the first time. Of course, it was going to have an effect on fertility rates. This is not particularly interesting as a data point. Contraceptives have the capacity to lower fertility rates in a population that has never been exposed to them. Duh. But what is interesting here, and the reason this is pocket sand, is that when you ban contraceptives in populations that already have them, that actually decreases fertility rates. As we saw with the Romania situation, where you get a sharp increase for a couple of years and then a sharp decrease.
Right.
And the reason is because then having lots of kids becomes associated with low wealth and low status, and nobody wants to do it. So the people with self-control stop having kids. It's a really bad way to increase fertility rates. But also just more broadly, I remember at the prenatalist conference, somebody was like, well, what do you think about banning condoms? And I was like, do I really want more people accidentally having kids? Like, is that the idea? Is that what I'm trying?
Yeah, that's the solution to our problems. More unwanted children.
Yeah, more unwanted children. That will solve the problem. I was like, that's a comical No, no, no. Not just for the children's sake, but from the genetic effects of something like that. That's just not healthy, right? So no, I had no. But again, pocket sand there. This one may not be pocket sand. In France, fertility fell 100 years before industrialization, while in England, the first country to industrialize, fertility did not decline for a century after industrialization.
Wasn't that in France, though, more a product of famine and hardship?
Yeah, there was famine and hardship during that period. There have been various studies that analyze this. The mainstream perception is that it was probably due to decline in religiosity. This is
Oh,
the one I've
interesting.
heard most. But remember what I said, all of Lyman's arguments, whenever you read him, he's like one of those far lefties who literally can only argue for far lefty positions, and you just know, like, okay, they're going to twist everything. And you get really interested when they're arguing something against her, or like Leather Apron Club. Like if Leather Apron Club ever argued a left-leaning position, I'd be like, this is something I need to take ultra seriously, because he would never do that. But if Lyman Stone is arguing Christianity good or socialism good, pretty much, I don't know. There's not that much you can take from it, but I will note that this does appear to be true. So the decline in marital fertility in France began around 1800, about 70 years before other European countries. And this is before other European countries. Some sources indicate the decline may have started even earlier in the 1760s. By 1840, France's marital fertility rate had fallen to 2/3 of its 1800 level. And
Oh,
by
yeah. So you
19
had the French Revolution, tons of secularization. Okay.
Yeah, and remember the hope problem. If you don't have
Yeah.
hope, you don't have kids.
Yeah, a lot of instability, a huge amount of change, and probably people just didn't know what to expect from their government and infrastructure and everything going forward.
But
So
let's
that
go over the various theories that have been put forward for this. And I
okay.
will note that in the 1800s, the average English woman was still having 6 children during this decline in France's fertility rate.
Yeah.
And so here are the various things here. Secularization, a decline in the influence of the Catholic Church may have led to a wider use of contraceptive and changing attitudes about family size. Cultural changes, the French Revolution may have played a major role in the change of social norms around family size. Economic pressures. Some people argue that pre-industrial France had limited economic opportunities, creating pressure to limit family size. Think about the economic famines and pressure that would have been created by the French Revolution.
Yeah, no
Like,
kidding.
obviously, even if you're in a status where income translates to kids, you're going to have lower number of kids there.
Right.
And land inheritance laws, post-revolution laws requiring equal division of property among heirs may have incentivized smaller families. That is definitely going to incentivize smaller families. So people who do not know this law was generally something historically that you would impose on a community that you had conquered. So famously, the English imposed this change in inheritance laws on the Irish after conquering them. Because why? Well, it quickly breaks up any large family with a lot of power if they have to split their land every generation among all of their descendants instead of
it distributes rather than consolidates their power.
increasingly consolidates. Yeah. So they ended up, not a great situation. So they ended up incentivizing lower fertility rates. But let's talk more about France's secularization, because this is worth talking about, and I found pretty interesting. France experienced a process of secularization and de-Christianization beginning in the 18th century, well before the French Revolution of 1789. This decline in religious influence occurred much earlier than in England. Secular wills increased from 10% in 1710 to 80% by 1780. So before the turn of the 1800s, long before the turn of the 1800s, 80% of wills were secular, from only 10% less than a century before. There was a significant decrease in the number of clergymen by capita by the end of the 18th century.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It arose as an attempt to reform Catholicism by bringing some Calvinistic doctrines, such as the depravity of man, predestination, irresistible grace, and limited atonement, entered. And this was a movement called the Jansenists. But the Jansenists were not Protestant. They were a reforming group of Catholics who some blame for this lower fertility rate. because they made but this doesn't really make sense because Calvinist groups in this time period had really high fertility rates. So I think this might be more just any sort of moderating, secularizing political force is going to have these problems. And we also need to ask why. We always mention that Catholics are uniquely susceptible to fertility collapse. Why the first of the European fertility collapse that happened in a Catholic country? And my guess is there's probably a big cross-correlating reason there. But do you have any thoughts before we move forwards?
If I had to guess, I would say it was mostly due to a period of cultural and religious and political turmoil where, to your point, more simply, there's just not really a lot of hope or certainty around the future. And I think when people don't have hope or certainty, they stop having kids, especially when they don't have, amazing, abundant resources or I guess a lot of social support. I don't think social support was that strong at this time either.
Yeah, the church offered some, but, it was limited compared to modern social support.
Yeah.
All right. So now we are going to talk about Africa. So another quote he has here. Today, fertility in Africa is lower than it was for Europe or Asian countries when they had similar income levels, because modern Africa, though poor, is nonetheless highly exposed to globalized cultural norms. At the individual level, when African women get richer, they actually tend to have more children. This came from an article called How Developmental Programs Impact Fertility Rates in Africa. And a quote from it is, however, another strand of the literature suggests that fertility can increase with greater wealth if the household desires more children than it can now afford. And it mentions here Lindo 2010, Black et al. 2013, Loverman and Mumford 2013. Previous work has also shown that women may have more children to ensure economic security in old age from both a theoretical and empirical perspective. And here it lists 5 papers that I'm sure you don't care about. The last channel is particularly important in a context like sub-Saharan Africa for 3 main reasons. First, pension systems are either weak or non-existent. Second, men typically marry women who are significantly younger, meaning that most women anticipate ending up as widows. Third, customary laws and norms often exclude women from property ownership and inheritance.
So this almost reminds me of the way that people handle retirement programs with money. Like if you have more income when you're young, you will save more money typically for your retirement. You'll put more into a 401k, you'll set stuff aside in Roth IRAs in the United States. So you'll be saving more for your retirement. And perhaps in Africa, the equivalent of that in some areas is, well, if I have more income now, that means I can do more to prepare for my old age, which is have more children, because then I have a more diversified portfolio of caregivers. Yeah. That's interesting.
Well, I actually think everyone should be viewing children this way right now.
Really? From a caregiver perspective? I don't know if I like that. From an income
perspective, I will explain.
Okay.
Do you think that you or I are going to get Social Security?
No.
Okay. Do you think that there's going to be a robust Medicare system in the United States when you and I are older?
No, but I wouldn't want my children to pay for it.
Hold on. We're going to talk about a few other things here. I'm just pointing out to people, okay? If you think anything other than your kids, they can say, well, I could save money, right? I could save money and that could support me in my old age. Here's the problem with saving money in this global economy as it exists right now.
Okay.
If fertility decline has the effect that I expect it to have, and AI is not a literal deus ex machina getting us out of this situation, we could enter a state of persistent economic decline instead of the average aggregate economic growth our ancestors faced.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what made compound interest is what made saving money a smart thing to do on average. Okay. A growing global economy is what made saving money a good idea. If we don't have that, saving money is next to setting it on fire. Worse, it would be, like saving money in Argentina or something. Worse, you have the problem of the United States becoming more and more Argentina-like. We talked about this in another episode in terms of like how costly it is to build infrastructure, how much the bureaucracy costs, how much cronyism there is on the Democratic side of the aisle.
I mean, there's cronyism on the Republican side too. Thank you very much.
No, not at all.
In the establishment?
No, not in regards to the way it works in Argentina. There's like mild
Oh,
cronyism, but there is not Peronism type cronyism, which is what leads to like hyperinflation and stuff like that.
mm,
It's a completely different scenario. There's a difference between, like low level nepotism and stuff like that, and literally paying for your votes
mm.
through massive, massive, massive bureaucratic programs. But there is the secondary issue that we have here, okay, which is wage inflation. So for people who don't know what wage inflation means, it means that now this is great for our kids, okay? It means that if you have a world where the number of workers is dropping really, really quickly, the amount you have to pay every individual worker goes up dramatically. And we've actually seen this. If you look at the recent inflation that we've experienced as a country, it's really been concentrated in wage inflation, especially with lower and lower skilled workers' wages going up.
Yeah.
Some specialty skilled worker wages going up. And that means that your kids are a really safe way to make money so long as AI just doesn't strictly replace them. So you need them to be at some base level of competence. But other than that, it's not as smart to think that you are going to be able to afford the types of services or anything comparable to your existing life in your old age.
But do you think it's right to put that on children?
Mm-hmm. If it motivates more kids. I don't think kids should support a useless older person who's not providing them any services.
Yeah, but I guess, if we go back to like older people being housekeepers, childcare providers, then it makes sense. If you're literally exchanging housing and food with full-time childcare and probably elite education, then I guess I could see that for sure.
Okay, you can see it now for sure, maybe.
Yeah. Hey, I don't want our kids to get a bad deal, even when that involves me.
I appreciate your diligence and dedication to fairness. One thing that I think is going to become quite the trend, and this is something we should probably do another episode on, is people's retirement plans being a bullet. I've noticed this a lot for people in our generation.
Just euthanasia. Yeah.
Yeah, where
more people are saying this? That's great.
Oh yeah, it's pretty common online these days. It might actually be interesting to do a survey on this.
People are posting like pictures of a gun and being like, "Look, it's my retirement plan."
No, they just are like, "Oh, I don't really save for retirement because I plan to end my life."
Yeah, I mean, everyone says that, and then they chicken out, except for our family, apparently.
Except for our family, everyone else pusses out.
We follow through. God, that's terrible.
Well, I mean,
true.
It's realistically the only thing that a lot of people are going to have available to them, especially the ones that didn't have kids.
Yeah, but also for families in many respects, like you can see how it plays out when family members who can't take care of themselves really ruin the lives of what you would call the sandwich generation. Mm-hmm. And our government also in the United States, in many states at least, does not even support them. For example, in Pennsylvania, one of the constituents in our district who's giving me advice on policy, who's an accountant, has pointed out that if you are caring for a dependent family member who's an older adult, you can't count them on your state tax return as a dependent, meaning that you're not.
What?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of people who are caring for parents and older family members, and they're not getting support from the state. They're not getting any help. It's bad. So, yeah.
Well, you could draft something to reverse that. That would be.
Oh, it's on my list, but
popular bill.
My odds of getting elected are 7% per my calculation, just given the makeup of our district, despite all my efforts. So we'll see.
Oh, we'll see. So now, how does Lyman Stone argue? So something to note here is that African fertility rates are falling way slower. Everyone thinks they're falling way slower than they should be. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Based on their income level. Like they are not falling at the same rate as other countries did when they hit their same income level. Mm-hmm. But in some areas, they're falling faster than people expect, blah, blah, blah. Now, Lyman Stone made the claim, this is not true. And then he put up a bunch of graphs. However, it's a bit of a pocket sand situation again, as I've mentioned. He said this is not true. And then all of the graphs he puts up are comparing child mortality rates with fertility rates instead of income level with fertility rates, because he
Okay.
claims it's a good proxy for income level. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, basically, he found one graph where things lined up and he didn't want to think about it anymore because it doesn't fit any of his agendas. And so he then just made this claim and hoped people wouldn't notice that he was pretending that child mortality rates were societal development indexes or income levels when they aren't. But I will put two of these graphs on screen here because they are nonetheless interesting. Here you have one that just shows, a broad alignment between child mortality rates and fertility rates. And then here you see one that is titled, Africa's fertility rate is about normal for its developmental stage. And then if you look at the axes, it's total fertility rate and child mortality. Like, if people wonder what I mean when I'm like, he's really intentionally manipulative with data, this is what I'm talking about.
Or just in terms of the sometimes lazy or manipulative tendency to just throw in stats or a study or a graph and know that most people aren't going to look closely at it and just be like, oh yeah, he backed it up, and just read the headline. Lyman Stone, as much as we respect his work,
I don't respect
abuses that tactic egregiously.
Pocket sand.
I don't respect his work at all. Well, sorry, somebody can do, obviously he puts diligence in, and I appreciate that. But overall, he is the net negative to the movement, and we'd be better if he wasn't in it.
Well, the internet loves a flame war, so yeah.
Right? Well, I mean, look, Simone,
he hates us. He hates us, so there's that.
Of course he hates us because we have integrity, and that doesn't help him. I mean, look, this is a problem, right? If you're going to consistently put out claims that are just patently false, right? And you have a big platform and you're part of a movement, it makes everyone else in the movement look bad or uninformed or manipulative. And so it reflects very poorly on work we are trying to do. Fortunately, almost nobody reads his work except for pronatalists, right? The problem is just making sure pronatalists know it's not that his work has no utility. You'll get lots of interesting stats. He's put together some graphs that have really changed my perspective on things. But the one that changed my perspective most, he used to argue for the exact opposite direction it changed my mind when I actually read it.
Yeah.
The famous fertility rate correlation to cash handouts when you account for the
margin of error.
It was the margin of error getting smaller the lower the rate it said was. And I just don't think he noticed this when he was putting together the graph, maybe, because the graph he uses to argue that cash handouts do work, when it's literally the single best argument I've ever seen that cash handouts don't work. But anyway, and I'd be happy to have him. Like, he could do a good job if he could, I don't know, work towards a position of personal integrity. I have to ask, why does he feel the need to do this all the time? And the only answer I can come to is his moral system is so far based within his theocratic mindset that everything is about promoting his particular theocratic agenda, which is about socialist redistribution and spreading his particular brand of theology's message. And so there is no moral qualms for him, either in setting back the pronatalist movement by manipulating the way data is presented, pocket sanding, or, just causing people to focus on potential solutions to fertility collapse that, like, we should know won't work, like cash handouts, because they don't. Like, go see our episodes on this. We talk about it all the time. It just doesn't seem to work, and everyone else agrees it doesn't work. That was one of my favorite parts. We were sitting down with the Heritage Foundation and all the fertility experts, and they were like, okay, so I read in this one place that this one guy thinks this works, but, like, everyone else says they don't work. Like, they don't work, right? And we were like, yeah, they don't work. And everyone else at the table was like, yeah, that's the Lyman Stone thing. So anyway, again, another graph here. This graph is titled, Africa's fertility is normal for its mortality level. Ooh, this one is titled, honestly, I like that. And here it is with the mortality of children under 5. Unfortunately, I mean, it would be nice if he said the child mortality level, but, okay, it works here. But this I actually found pretty interesting, and I'm going to put this on screen here. This isn't a graph. It's a heat map of Africa that looks at where fertility rates are unexpectedly low or unexpectedly high based on these child mortality metrics. And the place where they are unexpectedly low is South Africa and places like Morocco and Northwestern Africa. And this makes a lot of sense to me. You know, these are regions that are right now undergoing a significant collapse. They were some of the more industrialized parts of Africa, and they were really industrialized during that period where I think people still had the fantasy of industrializing Africa in the same way other countries were industrialized, which, you know, most people have given up on at this point. Do you have thoughts on that?
That's good. Yeah. Then you found something nice to say. That's good. That's good.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's tied to his thing. It still hasn't really shown this trend that he's claiming. Now we're going to look in the United States at TFR by income level, breaking down groups by ethnicity. Okay.
Okay.
So there is some interesting stuff in this graph. Generally, in this graph, so I'll read what he says.
Okay.
In the United States, correlations between fertility and income differ wildly by race. Among whites and to a lesser extent Asians, it tends to rise with income, except for the high fertility and very poor. And by contrast, wealthy Black and Hispanic women have rather low birth rates, while foreign-born women exhibit little connection between income and fertility. So, I mean, this is what he says the graph says, which is something he does this all the time. But I'll go over what the graph actually shows for anybody who's watching on a podcast, okay?
Listening, yeah.
Listening. So, native-born non-Hispanic whites. The less money you have when you are below the, looks around 15% bottom income demographic, so household income decimal, if you're below the bottom 15%, it goes way up, sort of in direct correlation with the amount of poverty your family's in.
This makes a lot of sense in the United States, and I just want to highlight, which I've said in other podcasts, how in the United States especially, if you are at or near the poverty line, basically a huge portion of your expenses as a parent are covered by state governments. Your child's daycare, medical care, food, it's all covered.
But here's what's interesting.
Yeah.
Why does it go up as you get poorer? If that explained high fertility rates among low-income groups, what you would expect is basically everyone below
would just be high.
The bottom 10% would just be high. It wouldn't be a direct and linear line going up.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have an answer for that. I think when you get closer, like higher in income, you're going to have more variation between
so here's
having the services and not having the services. Like you may be going in and out of it.
The less wealth you have, you can almost think of it as like income security, but the income security is around these government incentive programs and these government payment programs. So this income security drives up your fertility rate. Now, what is interesting is while you get sort of a flat white fertility rate here until you get to 20%. If you're looking at between 20% and around 65% in terms of the household income percentile, okay? So I'm going to say this again, between 20% and 65% in the white population, you have a steadily increasing fertility rate.
Yeah, and but to your point, basically the poorer you are in the United States, the more secure your income is for support in childcare, food for your kid, and medical care for your kid.
Yeah, but what I just said is a steadily increasing as you go from 20% to 65%.
So closer to poverty. You're saying, yeah, as you get poorer, but as you get poorer.
I'm saying increasing, i.e. as you get wealthier, you have more kids.
Oh. So as you get closer to not having support for.
So basically what this seems to indicate, and the way I read this, is that below the sort of 10% range, these are individuals who are living off the state. And then, you know, below the 20% range, they are marginally living off the state in some capacity. And then after that, the money is able to go to kids, you know, like they basically break from the state. And that's why they're at the very bottom of the fertility metric when they're at like the 20% low income level, and they rise until they get to the 60th or the 65% level. Okay. So do you want me to send this graph to you?
Yeah, I want to see it. Oh, okay. This is so helpful.
Okay, and so now you can see that after that, so basically for middle income white Americans, the more money you have, the more kids you're going to have. But then you hit something which I'm going to call the replacement rate ceiling, where as soon as it hits 2, it bounces off it and starts going down again as you get more money than that. And here I think that this is an urban monoculture thing. If you're above the 65 income percentile, you're likely in some way involved in an urban monoculture industry. And that's why you see the fertility rate going down again until you get to above 90%. And 90% to 100%, again, you have a linear increase that still, even when you get to 100%, is barely above 2. At no point does this really go above repopulation rate. And this is for the white households.
It's interesting. These graphs have these sort of almost heartbeat like fluctuations. It makes me think they correspond with tax brackets in some way. I'm not really sure though.
Yeah, they might. But anyway, so the next group, well, let's talk about blacks, because that's an interesting group. Non-Hispanic blacks. Non-Hispanic blacks, this is pretty strictly the less money you have, the more kids you have.
Yeah, it's wild.
Black populations respond to fertility rate. However, the correlation is strongest between around 10%, so people in the bottom 10%, up to people at around 25% to 30%. And in that range, you just have a really quick increase. The poorer you are from 30% to 10%, the more kids you're going to have if you're black. But there's 2 really interesting things about this. Once you get above 30%, it continues to go down a bit, but it's mostly even. Like if you are above 30%, as a black American, you're basically going to be near bottom black fertility rates in the United States. But, and here's the really interesting part, it's below 10%. In the black American population, below 10%. Remember how in the white population, fertility shot up for that demographic? In the black population, fertility shoots down in that demographic. Now, I should note that while it's shooting down, it's still way above the impoverished white fertility rate.
Yes.
So low income black fertility rate is just like way above low income white fertility rate. And what this shows with the black population, and this is something I've argued in other episodes, and it's just something for like black community members to take super seriously, is income is far more dysgenic for the black community in the United States than any other American demographic.
Yeah, what is going on?
Sorry, when I say it's way more dysgenic, what I mean is you are specifically genetically selecting for whatever correlate is tied to low income within the black community, much more so than you are in other communities where you just don't have a very strong correlation. Other communities that don't have a strong correlation would be the white community. The correlation's a bit all over the place, but probably not enough to have like a massive genetic effect. It's pretty all over the place. And foreign-born women, pretty all over the place. The other group that has a very strong dysgenic selective pressure, but not as strong as the black American community, is the native-born Hispanic population.
Yeah, it's not as dramatic, but the directionality is the same.
Well, it basically, like the black population, well, so unlike the black population, it doesn't have that weird drop between 0% and 10% percentiles.
Yeah.
But what it does have is if you go from 0% to around 30%, it's just like a constant drop. And then after that, it levels off and it stays a bit higher than high income black fertility does. In fact, this is a really interesting thing. Once you get above the 30% income demographic, black fertility rate is pretty much the lowest fertility rate in the United States by a pretty dramatic margin. Keep in mind, you can sort of ignore the purple line here because the purple line is native-born, non-Hispanic, other Asian multi, which is like fine, but it doesn't really mean anything about any specific demographic that I can target or say anything about. So if you ignore the purple line, blacks have a very low fertility rate when they get any amount of income, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
And I've seen this in our friend groups, actually, because we know a lot of wealthy black people. I don't know any wealthy black people with kids. One I can think of.
I can think of 2 friends, but not many.
Adopted?
Not many.
Are you
And
thinking of the one who adopted?
no,
Okay. Because I know the adoptee one, and I wasn't counting them, but I guess I should. But yeah, it's tough, and it's definitely something I notice like within our friend group.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, well, gosh, now I feel more confused than anything. I don't know what to make of it.
You feel more confused?
Yeah, I thought
mean,
I'd get some takeaways from these exceptions, but
well,
it
I mean, I
seems
think that the core thing is that social services should never be gated for just support. That's the way I feel about basically any data I've looked at.
yeah, for
I am
sure.
okay with social services, but if you're offering a social service to anyone, you should be offering it to everyone.
Yeah.
Period. Otherwise, it leads to really negative economic and effects like this. Okay, so next point here. Among the Amish and Ultra-Orthodox Jews in the US, fertility is negatively correlated with income. Poorer income brackets have 6 to 8 children, while the richer ones have 3 to 5. Overall, the higher fertility of these two groups compared to other Americans is overwhelmingly driven by cultural factors. That's really interesting. That among Ultra-Orthodox Jews and Amish, fertility is negatively correlated with income.
But that makes sense to me because in those instances, I view more income as being correlated with more integration with mainstream society and therefore the urban monoculture. So the less income you have, probably the more you are purely within your community and not making money from the outside world. And that's the bigger theme of demographic collapse, that industrialization, leaving the house, integrating with a larger economy, working for larger businesses that are not owned for your family. All of those things drive fertility collapses.
Then he does another little pocket sand here. I'm going to see if you can catch where the pocket sand is in this. Among the Arab countries, which range from poor to oil rich, there is no national correlation between wealth and lower fertility, which, I mean, first of all, I mean, the graph shows the exact opposite. Okay? The graph shows. Yeah, I'll send you the graph because this is one of those things where I just am astounded that he will do this all the freaking time. Well, he'll be like, this graph shows this. And then I read the graph and I'm like, it literally shows the exact opposite of what you just said it shows. This is the graph that he's claiming that shows that more income a Arab country has that doesn't correlate with it having a lower fertility rate. It's literally an up and to the left graph. What you could claim with this graph maybe is that the Gulf states aren't subject to this trend, but other MENA countries are.
Maybe that's
But
what
even
he's trying to say.
it's even sort of true among the Gulf states. Look.
Yeah, if we were to draw like an averaged line, what is that linear regression? God, it's been too long since I've taken a math class. But if we were to, do like a normalized line, it would be down into like a downward sloping line. So
Yeah.
Pocket sand.
Pocket sand.
All right, fine.
But also, it wouldn't even matter to me if this was true. Because it's like, why isn't there this great fertility collapse once you're talking about the Gulf states? Because the Gulf states do not distribute income in any sort of meaningful, equal way. This is looking at GDP per capita, not median GDP per capita.
All right.
Gulf states are freaking wacky when it comes to how wealth is distributed within them. And then I'd want to, make sure that we are talking specifically about their native population's fertility rate, which it can be very hard to break out in these countries, or is it naturally broken out in a lot of the statistics on the countries because they have huge immigrant populations, which have much higher fertility rates than the native fertility rate. And then the native fertility rate within these countries has all sorts of other weird things going on with it because they often treat maintaining the native population, which is a vast minority population, as some sort of like Spartan duty, right? To maintain the master class so the slaves don't revolt. Like, no, I mean, you see this, right? Like they see themselves as very different than the other people in their countries. And they do see it as a crisis that their populations are crashing, and they are often crashing. Oh, actually, I can just look at this and immediately tell you that this is not looking at native populations, because I know the native population fertility rates for some of these countries, like Emirati and Dubai, and they're way below 2. So this is including immigrants, which basically means this is a pointless graph. Okay, fantastic. That doesn't even show what he wants it to show. So what was the study that you found, Simone?
Right. I was reading the other day an essay by Emil Kierkegaard looking at Norwegian cognitive inequality. There was research in 2024 published about the correlation between educational attainment and developing dementia, but it just happened to have other interesting longitudinal data. There should be the caveat that this was looking longitudinally at men specifically who were born in the 50s. So this is not, we're not looking at people right now, but it did find that for lower groups in terms of educational attainment or IQ did have lower male fertility. And this also is seen in another study from Norway and other research in Sweden. He writes, male fertility for the mean 70 IQ group is markedly lower. This is the same as seen as in a prior study from Norway and Sweden based on overlapping data, so that's good. This does not mean Norway has eugenic fertility, because this data set only concerns men and only those who took the test, those who were not disqualified prior for some reason. And then he shares the Swedish and other Norwegian study information, which show a marked male dip in fertility for those with quite low IQ, which does produce a slight eugenic fertility pattern for men in these Nordic regions. Most of the stuff that you've pointed to in this conversation has been overall fertility, both men and women. And I do think based on the pressures that men and women are subject to, and also just looking at the history of whose genes get passed on, that it would make sense to me that most dysgenics have to do with women and not with men, because it's just harder as a man to gain access to a woman and get her pregnant if you are sick or less fit in some way or less intelligent, like significantly, right? If you're uniquely dumb and you have uniquely terrible social skills and you're uniquely ugly and you're like malformed or whatever, right? It's just going to be harder to get a woman. Ask all the black pill community, So
yeah,
when I first told you this, you're like, no, that's just not true. Everything refutes this. But this 2024 study is not alone in finding this correlation. There's another Swedish study and another Norwegian study that finds it. And 2, it just makes logical sense to me that
Sweden and Norway, keep in mind, are very different culturally from other places, but are very culturally similar to each other.
Sure. Okay. So you're just saying, well, and he did point out that some of it was overlapping data, but I don't know, intuitively, it would make sense to me that on the dysgenic front, men are subject to more evolutionary pressures, even in a post-industrial society, than women are. And often when you look at the people who are having a lot of kids, it's much more common to see men who have had multiple female partners, maybe not concurrently, but over a series of relationships or marriages. Consider how many wives your dad has had. And my dad has had 3 partners, like long-term monogamous and not all at the same time. And your dad, same, not all at the same time, but still. And there are lots of men who in turn go with no partners at all.
True.
And yeah, so I just want to point out that I do think that wealth probably correlates with higher fertility in men on average, if we were to have really good data to look at that, because men with more money probably also have other elements of fitness.
Well, this is bringing up an interesting relationship dynamic in which you're having sort of a functional type of harem, but you are basically staying with one woman until she's infertile, then you're exchanging her for another.
Well, that's modern polygamy that exists functionally and is extremely normalized in our culture, and yet not really seen as polygamy. It's worse though, because like a normal polygamist, like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, you can see pictures of their wives. A lot of them were super old, and many of them were widows. And he said both of them claimed to take on, many of their wives as just to take care of them because they were widows. And some of them had also 14-year-old wives too. Don't worry about that. But that seems to me in many ways a little bit kinder than dumping a wife, like a postmenopausal wife, and then marrying a much younger woman later.
Here's my question for you. When
Okay.
you're infertile, am I allowed to take on a younger wife? I won't dump you, but we've got to keep the babies coming, right?
I'm not into raising someone else's kids.
Wait, well, hold on. What if they were from your embryos?
Do I have to live with them? I don't like being around people. That's the problem.
No, okay, I understand.
Everyone has a price, I think, is the answer to this. And in many sister wife situations, it actually works really well and the families work out quite well. And I'm sure that there are people where I'd be like, oh my gosh, yes, let's do this. But you got to find the right.
I've got to find the right person. That's my duty here. Okay.
Well, I didn't want to marry anyone. Let's keep that in mind, let alone multiple people.
By the way, I'm not seriously suggesting this. I'm just getting a feel, when I need to think about what's going to happen when you become infertile. I don't know. I don't know how I'm going to feel if I live in a house without young kids in it anymore. That's a tragedy.
I have no
when your youngest kid ages out of the house, and you're never going to spend those moments again.
Let's cross that bridge when we get to it.
I haven't. I love it when people are like, when is your wife going to stop having kids? You must be almost done at this point. And I'm like, I haven't even normalized to the idea that I may at some point in my life be living in a house without toddlers in it.
Well, no, I mean, our plan is by the time I can no longer have babies and we no longer have toddlers, we have grandkids. So there will always be pitter-pattering little feet.
Pressure them into...
I mean, they're already down with it. They're ready. So.
Yeah. Anyway, I love you to death, Simone.
I love you too, Malcolm Collins.
All right, have a good one. Bye.